He was supposed to be asleep. So why did the rancher suddenly grab her wrist the moment she touched his wounded foot? The fire cracked low in the study as Loretta knelt beside the long chair, steam rising from the basin in her hands. Snow hammered the ranch windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Silas Turner hadn't moved once since she entered the room. But when her fingers brushed the split skin near his heel, his hand clamped around her wrist. So fast the water trembled across the floorboards. Then his eyes opened in the dark. What do you think he was really hiding all those years alone at Cedar Ridge Ranch? Snow came sideways across Hollow Creek that evening, sharp enough to sting exposed skin raw. The wind pushed through the narrow street between the feed store and the barber shop, carrying loose ice and the smell of wet horses. Most folks had already gone inside by the time the stagecoach rattled to a stop beside Mercer's general store. Loretta Hayes stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the rail. Her boots hit slush and frozen mud. The hem of her dark wool coat was soaked from the journey south out of Cheyenne. She stood still for a second, breathing through the cold while the driver unloaded a single suitcase and a rolled blanket tied with twine. Nobody waited for her. The town looked faded beneath the storm. Lamplight glowed weak behind frosted windows. Somewhere farther down the road, a piano played through the walls of a saloon before the wind swallowed it whole again. "You the girl Mrs. Calloway wrote about?" the driver asked. Loretta nodded once. He pointed west toward the dark hills. "Cedar Ridge is another mile past the creek crossing, big gate with iron horses on it. Can't miss it." She thanked him softly and lifted her suitcase. By the time she reached the ranch road, snow had gathered thick across the fence posts. Cedar Ridge appeared slowly through the storm like a ship rising from fog. The house stood enormous against the mountain backdrop, 3 stories of timber and stone lit by oil lamps glowing amber through the windows. Yet, for all its size, it looked lonely. Loretta climbed the porch steps with numb fingers and knocked. Several seconds passed before the door opened. Mrs. Calloway stood there, holding a lantern. Her gray hair was pinned tight beneath a dark bonnet, her expression careful but not unkind. "Lord above," she muttered, You're frozen through." Loretta managed a tired smile. "The coach wheel broke near Black Creek." "Well, come inside before you die on my porch." Warmth hit her first. Then the smell of cedar smoke and old leather. The entrance hall stretched wide beneath mounted antlers and dim chandeliers. A grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase, loud in the silence. Somewhere deeper in the house, floorboards creaked. Mrs. Calloway took Loretta's coat. "Mr. Turner hasn't agreed to anything permanent yet," she said while hanging it near the stove. "He doesn't like strangers in his house." "Understood. He doesn't like much of anything these days." Before Loretta could answer, heavy footsteps sounded overhead. Silas Turner descended the staircase slowly, one hand sliding along the polished rail. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark coat still dusted with snow. His face carried the rough wear of Wyoming winters and too many sleepless nights. He stopped halfway down when he saw her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Loretta lowered her eyes respectfully, though she still felt the weight of his gaze. Mrs. Calloway cleared her throat. "This is Loretta Hayes." Silas looked at the suitcase by the door. "You came through this storm alone?" "Yes, sir." His eyes narrowed slightly, as though trying to understand what kind of woman would do such a thing. "She can sew," Mrs. Calloway added quickly. "Cook, too. And we need help." Silas removed his gloves one finger at a time. "Temporary," he said flatly, "until winter breaks." Relief flickered quietly across Loretta's face. "Thank you, sir." He gave a short nod and crossed toward the study without another word. The door shut behind him. Mrs. Calloway exhaled through her nose. That went better than expected. Loretta glanced toward the closed study door. "Does he always seem so tired?" The older woman stared at the fire a long moment before answering. "Ever since the fever took his wife and boy." Nothing else needed saying after that. That first night, Loretta unpacked in a small room near the back stairs. The window rattled from the storm. The mattress sagged in the middle, but it was warm, and after weeks of uncertainty, warm felt close enough to mercy. Sometime past midnight, she woke to coughing, deep, violent, painful enough to echo through the hallway. Loretta pulled on her sweater and stepped outside her room. Light spilled beneath the study door. The coughing came again. She hesitated before knocking softly. No answer. When she pushed the door open slightly, she found Silas alone beside the dying fire. Papers covered the desk. A whiskey glass sat untouched near his elbow. One hand pressed hard against his ribs, while the other covered his mouth. "You should see the doctor in town," Loretta said quietly. Silas looked up immediately, eyes hard from instinct more than anger. "I'm fine." Another cough betrayed him before the words settled. Loretta noticed the mud frozen across his boots and the dark stain soaking one sock near the ankle. "You're bleeding. That's not your concern." Silence stretched between them. Then, softer this time, she said, "No, sir." He held her gaze a second longer before looking back toward the fire. "Go to bed, Miss Hayes." She did. But long after returning to her room, she still heard that cough echoing through the walls of Cedar Ridge Ranch. 3 nights later, the storm returned worse than before. Silas came home near midnight after checking fence lines west of the canyon. Benji helped unsaddle the horse while snow piled thick against the porch rails. Loretta watched quietly from the kitchen doorway. Silas limped climbing the stairs. Later, after the house had gone still, Mrs. Calloway handed Loretta a basin of steaming water. "He won't ask for help," she said. "But infection kills harder than bullets in winter." Loretta carried the basin carefully down the dark hallway. The study fire burned low. Silas sat stretched across the long chair near the hearth, eyes closed, boots still on. His breathing sounded slow and heavy beneath the crackle of firewood. Asleep, she thought. She knelt beside him quietly. The leather of his boot was stiff with frozen mud. When she pulled it free, his sock came away, spotted with blood from a cracked heel rubbed raw inside the boot. Loretta frowned softly. "No one should work themselves into the grave this way," she murmured under her breath. She dipped the cloth into warm water and pressed it gently against the split skin. Silas did not move. Her fingers worked carefully, slow enough not to wake him. Steam drifted upward between them. Outside, wind battered the windows. For a moment, the whole ranch seemed to disappear until there was only the firelight and the roughness of his injured foot resting against her palm. Then suddenly, his hand closed tight around her wrist. Loretta gasped. Silas's eyes were open, dark, awake, watching her. Neither moved. The fire cracked softly beside them while snow hissed against the glass. His grip loosened slightly, but not fully. Loretta's pulse fluttered beneath his fingers. And for the first time in years, something warm stirred inside the house that had forgotten how to live. Silas released her wrist slowly, as though he had only just realized he was holding it at all. The fire cracked low beside them. Loretta lowered her eyes first. "I didn't mean to wake you, sir." "You didn't." His voice came rough from exhaustion. He shifted upright in the chair, reaching for his boot. Loretta stopped him gently. The skin split open again. Silas looked down at her hand, resting lightly against his ankle. Small hand. Warm hand. He swallowed once and leaned back without another word. Outside, snow scraped against the windows like dry bones. Loretta cleaned the cracked skin carefully, using a folded cloth from the basin. She worked quietly. No fuss, no pity in her face. That seemed to unsettle him more than sympathy would have. Most people around Hollow Creek either feared him or tried too hard to please him. This woman simply looked at him like he was tired. When she finished wrapping the heel with fresh linen, she stood and gathered the basin. "You should rest more," she said softly. Silas watched her near the doorway. "You always tell your employers what to do." A faint smile touched her mouth before she hit it. Only the stubborn ones. The door shut behind her. Silas sat there long after the fire burned down to red coals. The next morning, the ranch woke beneath pale gray skies. Snow rested thick across the corrals and fence rails. Benji hurried through the yard, carrying a sack of feed nearly half his size while stable horses stomped steam into the cold air. Loretta stood in the kitchen, rolling dough beside the stove. Her sleeves were folded to her elbows, revealing flour-dusted wrists. A pot of chicory coffee simmered nearby. Mrs. Calloway sniffed the air. "Cornbread? My mama used to make it during storms." "Well," the older woman glanced toward the dining room. "Maybe that'll finally get Mr. Turner to eat before noon." Silas entered a few minutes later, pulling leather gloves from his coat pocket. Snow melted off his boots onto the wooden floorboards. He stopped. The kitchen smelled different. Warm, not just coffee and smoke anymore. Butter, cornmeal, something sweet underneath it all. Loretta placed a plate near the stove without looking directly at him. Fresh from the skillet. Silas stared at the cornbread a moment before sitting down slowly. Mrs. Calloway nearly dropped a spoon. Usually he took coffee alone in the study. This morning he stayed. Silence settled between them, but it no longer felt empty. Silas broke the cornbread apart with rough fingers. Steam rose from the center. He took one bite, then another. Loretta pretended not to notice, but Mrs. Calloway did. So did Benji, who grinned openly before Silas shot him a look. 3 days later, Loretta sat near the back porch, mending a tear in one of Silas's winter coats. Late afternoon light spilled gold across the snowbanks outside, while the windmill creaked slowly beyond the barn. Silas came through the hallway carrying ledger books beneath one arm. He paused when he saw the coat in her lap. That didn't need fixing. Loretta threaded another stitch calmly. The sleeve lining was coming apart. Silas stood there a second longer than necessary. "You notice everything, don't you?" She glanced up then. Just briefly, only things people ignore too long." Something unreadable crossed his face before he walked on. That night, Hollow Creek gathered at Mercer's saloon to escape the cold. Smoke hung thick beneath the ceiling, while boots scraped sawdust floors. Deputy Wade Miller leaned against the bar, sipping coffee instead of whiskey. "She's settling in up there?" he asked casually. Mrs. Calloway narrowed her eyes. "Who?" "The new girl. Loretta's doing her work same as anyone else." Wade nodded once. "Funny thing is, I heard her name before she arrived." The room quieted slightly around him. "She worked a station house down south," he continued, "until money went missing." One ranch hand whistled low. Wade shrugged. Might be gossip. Might not. By morning, the whispers had already spread through Hollow Creek. That evening, Helen Whitaker arrived at Cedar Ridge, wearing a dark blue traveling coat trimmed with fur. Her perfume entered the dining room before she did. "Silas," she said warmly, "you've hidden yourself away all winter again." He stood politely but did not smile. Helen's eyes drifted toward Loretta, setting plates at the table. "Oh," she said lightly. "So this is the new help." Loretta lowered her head respectfully. "Mom." Helen examined her a second too long before turning back toward Silas. "I do hope she understands proper boundaries," she murmured. Silas poured himself coffee. "Loretta understands her work just fine." The answer landed harder than a slap. Helen's smile tightened. Dinner passed beneath strained silence. Silverware clinked softly against china while wind rattled the dining room windows. Later that night, Loretta stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes. The house had gone quiet hours ago. Snowlight glowed pale beyond the glass. Without thinking, she began singing under her breath, an old hymn her mother used to hum while folding laundry near the fire. Low, gentle, worn smooth by memory. She didn't hear Silas enter. He stood just beyond the doorway, listening quietly, one shoulder against the frame. The sound filled the kitchen differently than silence ever had. Loretta turned suddenly and gasped. The bowl slipped from her hands. It shattered across the floor. "Oh!" Lord! She dropped immediately to her knees, gathering pieces before anyone stepped on them. Silas crouched beside her first. One sharp edge sliced her finger. She hissed softly. Without thinking, Silas caught her hand. Easy now, Loretta. The sound of her name in his voice stopped both of them cold. Not Miss Hayes, not girl, Loretta. For one long second, neither moved. Then footsteps echoed somewhere upstairs. Loretta pulled her hand back gently and lowered her gaze before he could see the color rising in her cheeks. But long after she went to bed that night, Silas remained standing alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence where her song had been. The storm arrived 2 days later. By dawn, the sky over Cedar Ridge had turned the color of iron. Wind bent the pine trees along the ridge line, and snow swept across the corrals in long white sheets. The horses grew restless before noon. Benji said they could feel bad weather in their bones long before people could. Silas stood near the barn doors fastening his gloves, while ranch hands loaded lanterns and rope into the supply wagon. The north fence gave way near Miller's Pass. One of the men shouted over the wind. Half the herd pushed toward the canyon. Silas grabbed his saddle blanket from a hook. Then we bring them back before the drifts bury them. Loretta watched from the stable doorway, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Snowflakes clung to her curls. You shouldn't go out there in this, she said quietly. Silas tightened the saddle strap without looking up. Those horses won't survive the night. The storm's getting worse. His hand paused briefly against the leather. Then he looked at her. For one strange second, the noise of the stable seemed to fade behind the sound of wind and breathing horses. I'll be back before dark, he said. Loretta nodded, though worry already sat heavy behind her ribs. By afternoon, the storm swallowed the valley whole. Snow hammered the windows of the ranch house. The hanging lamp above the kitchen table swayed slightly each time the wind struck the walls. Mrs. Calloway kept feeding wood into the stove, while Benji paced near the back door. No riders returned by sunset. At 7 o'clock, the church bell in Hollow Creek disappeared beneath the storm entirely. At 9, one of the ranch hands finally stumbled into the yard alone with ice frozen in his beard. We lost sight of Mr. Turner near the canyon crossing, he said breathlessly. Couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Mrs. Calloway's face drained pale. He'll shelter somewhere, she whispered, though it sounded more like prayer than certainty. Loretta stood motionless beside the stove. Then she crossed quietly toward the coat rack. Mrs. Calloway looked up sharply. No, he's still out there, and you'll die beside him in this weather. Loretta pulled on her gloves with shaking fingers. Maybe, her voice stayed soft, but I can't sit here listening for a door that may never open. The older woman stared at her a long moment before disappearing upstairs. She returned carrying an old lantern and a wool scarf. The hunting cabin sits east of Black Creek, she said quietly. If he found shelter anywhere, it'd be there. Loretta nodded once. 10 minutes later, she rode into the storm alone. Snow struck her face hard enough to sting tears from her eyes. The mare struggled through drifts that climbed nearly to its knees. Wind screamed across the canyon road, carrying loose ice that rattled against rock and pine. Twice she nearly lost the trail entirely. Silas, she shouted into the white dark. Only wind answered. Then, near the frozen creek bed, the lantern caught movement. A horse, half buried in snow. Loretta slid from the saddle and stumbled forward through knee-deep drifts. Silas lay against the rocks beside the animal, one gloved hand still twisted in the reins. Snow covered his coat and shoulders. Silas! She dropped beside him, brushing ice from his face with trembling hands. His eyes remained shut, but faint breath still escaped his lips. Relief hit her so hard her knees nearly gave way beneath her. Please, she whispered shakily. Please don't do this to me. It took nearly all her strength to drag him onto the horse and lead it toward the hunting cabin hidden among the pines. Inside, darkness and cold waited. Loretta forced frozen fingers to strike a match. After 3 tries, flame finally caught the lantern wick. The cabin slowly emerged around them. Dusty blankets, iron stove, split logs stacked near the wall. She got the fire going first. Then she knelt beside Silas. His skin felt frighteningly cold beneath her hands. Loretta removed his wet coat and boots carefully, laying blankets over him, while the stove crackled weakly nearby. She rubbed warmth back into his hands, her own fingers numb and red from cold. "Come on," she whispered. "Stay with me now." Hours passed that way. Wind shook the cabin walls. At some point she began talking, simply to keep him tethered to the sound of another human voice. She told him about Louisiana summers thick with heat, about her mother singing while hanging laundry behind the church, about riding north in crowded train cars, where nobody spoke much unless spoken to first. Silas stirred once but did not wake. Loretta's voice finally cracked. "I can't lose another place," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks unnoticed. "And I don't think I can bear losing you either." Silence answered her. Then sometime deep into the night, while snow buried the world outside, and Silas opened his eyes. Dim firelight flickered across the ceiling beams, and there, curled against him beneath the blankets, was Loretta. Her arms wrapped tightly around his chest, trying to keep warmth inside him. Silas stared at her sleepy face for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, as though remembering how after many empty years, he wrapped his arms around her too. By morning, the storm had worn itself down to a tired wind. Loretta woke first. For a moment, she did not move. The hunting cabin was dim, the stove nearly out, and Silas Turner's arm rested heavy across her back. Not rough, not claiming, just there, as if some part of him had reached for life while the rest of him slept. She eased away before he opened his eyes. By noon, 2 ranch hands found the cabin smoke and brought them back to Cedar Ridge. Mrs. Calloway cried once quietly, then scolded both of them for riding into weather fit only for wolves. Silas said little, but after that day he changed in ways nobody could miss. At breakfast, he waited until Loretta sat before touching his coffee. When she carried laundry through the hall, he stepped aside instead of walking past like she was furniture. If she lifted a water bucket too full, his hand reached for it before his pride could stop him. Small things. Hollow Creek saw them anyway. By the first thaw, the talk had reached every porch and counter in town. Loretta heard it at Mercer's General Store while buying flour, salt, and a spool of brown thread for Mrs. Calloway. 2 women fell quiet near the pickle barrel when she came in. A man by the stove watched her over the rim of his tin cup. The clerk wrapped her flour in brown paper and did not meet her eyes. Outside, Helen Whitaker stood beneath the striped awning, wearing a cream bonnet trimmed in blue ribbon. Deputy Wade Miller leaned against the hitching rail nearby, one boot crossed over the other. Helen smiled when Loretta stepped onto the boardwalk. "How fortunate you are," she said. "A roof at Cedar Ridge, new clothes, warm meals. Some girls do know how to rise quickly." Loretta's fingers tightened around the flour sack. Wade glanced down, jaw working, but said nothing. Loretta gave a small nod and walked past. Her boots sounded very loud against the boards. That evening, she folded her few belongings into the old suitcase she had carried from Cheyenne. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a receipt from the stage office. Her mother's worn handkerchief yellowed at the edges. She worked carefully, quietly, as if packing could hurt less if done neatly. The bedroom door stood half open. Silas saw the suitcase before she saw him. He stopped in the hall. Loretta froze with a dress in both hands. "You leaving?" he asked. She did not answer at first. The house creaked around them. Somewhere below, Benji laughed once in the kitchen, then Mrs. Calloway hushed him. Loretta folded the dress again, though it was already folded. "It would be better." "For who?" "For you, Mr. Turner." His face changed at the sound of that old distance. She swallowed. "They're talking worse now, Miss Whitaker. Men in town. Even Deputy Miller heard things about me from before. You have a name here. Land. Men who depend on you. I won't be the reason people look at you like. Like what? Her voice thinned. Like you forgot yourself. Silas stepped into the room slowly. He did not touch the suitcase. He only looked at it like it was a grave being dug in front of him. This house buried enough ghosts already, he said. I won't bury another. Loretta's hands went still. Silas looked at her then, not as the cold rancher people feared, but as a man who had stood too long in empty rooms. You want to leave because you don't feel safe here. I'll hitch the wagon myself. But don't leave because Hollow Creek forgot how to keep its mouth shut. Her eyes burned, but she looked down before tears could fall. The suitcase stayed open that night, but she did not close it. 3 days later, Hollow Creek held its spring dance in the old meeting hall beside the livery. Lanterns hung from the rafters. A fiddle and banjo played near the stove. Muddy boots stamped over fresh sawdust spread across the floor. Mrs. Calloway insisted Loretta come along to help bring pies. Loretta wore her plain dark dress and kept to the back table, arranging plates beside jars of peach preserves. She had nearly made it through the evening unseen when Helen Whitaker's voice carried over the music. Well now, Helen said, sweet as spoiled honey. Cedar Ridge brings its kitchen into public. A few people laughed softly. Loretta lowered her eyes and reached for another plate. Then the fiddle slowed. Bootsteps crossed the floor. The room quieted in a way that seemed to pull all the air with it. Silas Turner stood before her. His black coat was buttoned clean. His hair still carried a trace of rain from outside. He held out his hand. Dance with me. Loretta stared at him. No, she whispered. They're watching. Let them. Her breath caught. Around them, Hollow Creek waited. Helen's smile vanished. Deputy Wade stood near the door. Arms still, eyes narrowed. Loretta looked at Silas's hand, rough from reins and fence wire, steady as a gatepost. Then she placed her fingers in his. A sound moved through the hall, half shock, half disbelief. Silas led her to the center of the floor as the fiddle found a slow tune. His hand settled respectfully at her back. Hers rested against his shoulder, light enough to flee. But he looked at her and nowhere else. Lift your head, he said quietly. She did. They turned beneath the lantern light. For the first time since she had come west, Loretta did not make herself smaller. When the song ended, Silas leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Gentle, plain, in front of them all. No one laughed then. Silas kept her hand in his and faced the room. This is Loretta Hayes, he said. Any man or woman with something to say about her can say it to me first. The silence held. Then Mrs. Calloway began clapping from the back of the hall. Benji joined next, loud and proud. A few others followed, cautious at first. Loretta stood beside Silas with tears shining in her eyes. But she did not lower her head again. Across the room, Deputy Wade looked away. And by morning, he would ride south with an old question troubling him. The story about Loretta Hayes and the missing station money no longer sounded as simple as it once had. Spring arrived slowly across Wyoming. Snow melted in narrow lines along the ranch fences first. Then the creek behind Cedar Ridge began moving again, dark water slipping beneath broken ice. By April, muddy wagon tracks cut through Hollow Creek and patches of green pushed up through the hillsides like something stubborn refusing to die. Loretta noticed the change in Silas long before he spoke of it. He smiled now, not often, not wide, but sometimes, while fixing tack in the barn or watching Benji chase chickens from the porch. The heaviness would leave his face for a moment, and every time his eyes found her, something in him settled. Deputy Wade returned 3 weeks after the spring dance. His horse stopped outside the ranch near sundown. Dust coated his coat collar and the brim of his hat. He looked tired in a way that came from too many miles and not enough sleep. Loretta was hanging sheets behind the house when she saw him ride in. Silas stepped out from the barn. The two men stood near the hitching rail, speaking low enough the wind carried most of the words away. But Loretta saw Wade remove folded papers from inside his coat. Silas read them once, then again slower. At last he looked toward the clothesline where Loretta stood frozen beside white sheets snapping in the breeze. Wade approached her carefully. "I went down to Louisiana," he said. Spoke to the station owner's former clerk. Loretta's fingers tightened around the damp fabric in her hands. "The money never disappeared," Wade continued quietly. "Your employer took it himself, gambling debts. When the books stopped balancing, he blamed the nearest person, without family to defend her. For a second she could not breathe. All those nights sleeping in train depots, all those miles north, every stare, every whisper, built on a lie." Wade removed his hat slowly. "I should've looked harder before believing the talk." Loretta lowered her eyes. "Most folks didn't, but Silas did." Silence settled between them. Wade nodded once toward the rancher standing near the barn. "That man never asked me whether you were guilty." Her throat tightened. After Wade rode away, evening drifted softly across Cedar Ridge. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the cooling air. Somewhere down by the creek, frogs had started singing again after the thaw. Silas found Loretta sitting alone on the porch steps. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without speaking. She looked down at it a long moment before whispering, "You knew." "No," he said honestly. "I just didn't care what Hollow Creek thought it knew." Loretta blinked hard against sudden tears. Silas sat beside her, elbows resting on his knees. People who survive hard things learn to recognize each other. The porch lamp glowed softly above them. Loretta laughed once through her tears. Small, shaky. "You make it sound simple. It ain't." He looked out toward the darkening pasture. "I spent 3 years angry at God for taking my family. Angry enough I stopped speaking to people unless I had to." His jaw shifted once. "Then one winter night, a woman I barely knew knelt on my floor and worried more about my feet bleeding than herself freezing." Loretta lowered her head with a smile she could not hide. A few days later, Silas saddled his horse before sunset and asked her to ride with him. They crossed the western pasture where grass had finally returned beneath the melting snowbanks. The sky burned gold behind the mountains. Silas stopped near a hill overlooking the valley. At the top stood a blackened pine tree split by lightning years before. He helped Loretta down carefully. Wind moved through the grass around them. "My boy used to climb this tree," Silas said quietly. "Drove his mother near crazy doing it." Loretta stayed silent. Silas crouched near the roots and dug carefully beneath a flat stone. From the earth he pulled a faded blue cloth, folded neatly despite the years. "My son's bandana." He held it a moment before offering it to her. Loretta touched it carefully, almost afraid to. "This is the last thing I never let anyone touch," he said. His voice had gone rough again. "I thought keeping grief close meant I wasn't forgetting them." He looked up at her then. But somewhere along the way, grief turned into hiding. Loretta's eyes glistened in the evening light. Silas stood slowly. "I don't want to hide anymore." Then, there beneath the burned pine and the wide Wyoming sky, he reached for both her hands. "Loretta Hayes," he said softly. "I don't have fancy speeches. Never did. But if you'll stay, if you'll build a life here with me, I swear this ranch will never feel cold to you again." Her breath trembled. "Yes," she whispered before he could finish asking. "Yes, Silas." He laughed then, a real laugh, deep and surprised, like the sound had been buried too long. When he kissed her forehead, Loretta closed her eyes against him and let herself believe she had finally stopped running. Their wedding came in early summer beneath strings of oil lanterns hung across the ranch yard. Benji wore boots polished so hard they squeaked when he walked. Mrs. Calloway cried openly during the vows while pretending she had dust in her eye. Someone played fiddle music near the porch. Ranch hands danced with widows from town. Cornbread and smoked beef covered the long tables beneath white cloth. No grand church. No rich decorations, just warmth, just people, just home. 1 year later, laughter echoed through Cedar Ridge Ranch, where silence once lived. Loretta stood near the kitchen window, holding a sleeping baby girl wrapped in cream-colored blankets. Late afternoon sun spilled across the floorboards. Outside, Benji raced through the yard, chasing one of the pups from the stable dog's litter. Silas crossed the pasture, carrying a saddle over one shoulder. He stopped before stepping onto the porch. Inside the window glowed golden. Loretta smiled when she saw him coming, and in her arms their daughter slept peacefully against her chest. Silas stood there a long moment, simply looking at them. The light, the laughter, the life waiting behind that door. Years ago he thought winter had taken everything from him, forever. Now he understood something different. Sometimes the heart begins living again only after it has already learned how to survive being broken. And maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the storm, not the whispers in town, not even the loneliness that once filled every room in Cedar Ridge Ranch. Maybe it's the quiet truth underneath it all. That some people walk into our lives carrying warmth we didn't realize we'd been missing for years. If you've ever sat in a silent house after losing someone, if you've ever convinced yourself that your best days were already behind you, then maybe you understand Silas a little more than he ever would've admitted out loud. And maybe you understand Loretta too. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive in grand speeches or miracles. Sometimes it arrives with a cup of coffee left beside a cold porch rail, a hand reaching for yours in the dark, someone staying when the easier choice would have been leaving. That's what love looked like out on those Wyoming plains. Not perfect, not easy, but steady enough to outlast winter. And maybe that's what all of us are searching for in the end. If this story meant something to you, tell me which moment stayed in your heart the longest. And if you'd like, stay a while longer with us here. There are still more old frontier stories waiting beyond the next trail. Stories about lost people finding family, wounded hearts learning to trust again, and the kind of love that keeps a light burning in the window long after dark.